The ranch was quiet that morning, too quiet. The usual sounds of horses neighing, hooves clattering, and the chatter of ranch hands were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the wind as it whistled through the trees. Inside the stable, Shadow, the ranch's most prized black stallion, lay motionless on the soft bedding of hay and straw. His dark coat had lost its shine. His once powerful legs stretched out uselessly beneath him. His deep brown eyes, usually full of fire, now held only exhaustion. John Carter, the owner of Willow Creek Ranch, stood beside the veterinarian, Dr. Mitchell, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had raised Shadow from a foal, trained him, watched him become one of the most powerful and loyal horses on the ranch. Now, he had to make the hardest decision of his life. "There's no hope, John," Dr. Mitchell said with a sigh, running a hand through his graying hair. "His spinal cord is damaged. He won't be able to stand again." John swallowed hard. "And there's no way to fix it?" Dr. Mitchell shook his head. "Not with a horse. If he were a dog or a cat, maybe. But a horse that can't stand, can't survive." The words hit like a punch to the gut. John turned to look at his daughter, Emma, standing just outside the stall, her tiny hands gripping the wooden fence so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was only 6, but she understood what was happening. Tears welled up in her big blue eyes. "Daddy, you're not gonna let them take him, are you?" John felt his heart crack. He knelt down in front of her, resting a hand on her small shoulder. "Sweetheart, Shadow is suffering. He can't run anymore. He can't even stand. But he's still here," Emma whispered. "He still looks at me. He still listens. He's still my Shadow." John's throat tightened. He had seen grown men break under less pressure than this moment, but the hard truth was, he couldn't let Shadow waste away like this. Tomorrow morning. That was the plan. The vet would return, the sedative would be given, Shadow would drift away peacefully, without pain. It was the right thing to do. At least that's what John kept telling himself. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Emma snuck out of the house and ran to the stable, her tiny feet crunching against the dirt path. She wasn't ready to say goodbye. She wasn't ready to let go. So she did the only thing she could do. She curled up beside Shadow, laid her head against his neck and whispered, "I won't let them take you. I'll find a way. I promise." And as the fire in the lantern flickered and the stable fell into a deep hush, Shadow twitched. A flicker of movement, so small, so faint, that Emma almost missed it, but then it happened again, a single weak kick. Emma sat up, her heart pounding. "Shadow?" The stallion let out a soft breath, almost like a sigh. Emma frowned. "Daddy said Shadow couldn't feel his back legs. That's what the vet said too, but then why did he move?" She had no idea. She had just discovered something that would change everything. The stable was quiet, except for the soft rustling of hay as Emma sat beside Shadow, her small hands pressed against his dark coat. She could feel his slow, steady breathing, the warmth of his body against the cold night air. Her heart was still pounding from what she had just seen. Shadow moved. It wasn't much, just the faintest twitch in his back leg. But after everything the vet had said, after Daddy told her it was impossible, how could that be? She needed to know if it was real. Gently, Emma ran her fingers down Shadow's side, her touch feather-light. She reached his lower back, just above his hip, and pressed down. Shadow flinched. Emma's eyes widened. She pressed again, this time just a little harder. Another twitch. A thrill of excitement ran through her. Shadow wasn't completely paralyzed. He could still feel something. But why hadn't the vet noticed? Emma scrambled to her feet. She needed to tell Daddy, needed to tell someone before it was too late. But as she turned to run back toward the house, a deep, heavy sigh escaped from Shadow's chest. Emma hesitated. He looked so tired, so weak. His big brown eyes watched her with something that almost felt like understanding, like he was asking her not to leave him alone. And just like that, she made up her mind. She would stay. She had to stay. The sun had barely begun to rise when John Carter stepped out onto the porch, stretching his tired muscles. He hadn't slept much. He had spent half the night tossing and turning, thinking about Shadow. It wasn't supposed to be this hard. He had put down old horses before, ones that were too sick or too hurt to go on. It was part of ranch life, part of what had to be done. But Shadow was different. And Emma... A heavy sigh left his chest as he turned toward the stable. He had to wake her up before Dr. Mitchell arrived. It would break her heart, but he couldn't let her watch. As he approached the stable doors, he heard something that made him stop cold. A voice, soft but determined. "Emma, come on, Shadow," she whispered. "You can do it." John's stomach twisted. He stepped inside and his breath caught in his throat. Emma was kneeling beside Shadow, pressing her small hands against his side. Shadow flinched. John's heart nearly stopped. Flinched. "Emma." His voice was barely a whisper. "What are you doing?" Emma's head snapped up. "Daddy," she gasped, jumping to her feet. "Look, Shadow's not gone. He can still feel." John took a slow step forward, his boots crunching against the straw-covered floor. "What do you mean?" Emma quickly dropped to her knees again, running her hands down Shadow's back, stopping at the spot just above his hind legs. Then she pressed. Shadow twitched. John's throat went dry. "That's not..." His mind was racing. "Dr. Mitchell said he was paralyzed." "He's not," Emma cried. "He can still feel here. That means there's a chance, right? Right, Daddy?" John was speechless. He had spent years working with horses, knew their behaviors, their injuries, their limits. He had trusted the vet's diagnosis without question, but now he wasn't so sure. Before he could say another word, the sound of a truck engine rumbled in the distance. Dr. Mitchell was here, and suddenly John had a choice to make. Dr. Mitchell stepped out of his truck, carrying his bag with a solemn expression. He had done this before. Too many times to count. It never got easier, but it was part of the job. He entered the stable, expecting to see a lifeless, unmoving horse. Instead, he found a little girl standing defiantly in front of the stall, arms crossed over her chest. His brow furrowed. "John?" John exhaled a shaky breath. "There's been a development." Dr. Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "What kind of development?" Emma turned toward Shadow and placed her tiny hands on his back, pressing down on that one spot. Shadow twitched. Dr. Mitchell's eyes widened. John clenched his jaw. "I need you to check him again." The vet hesitated. He had been in this business a long time, and false hope was a dangerous thing. But something about the fire in John's eyes, in Emma's eyes, made him take a breath and step forward. For the next half hour, he ran test after test, this time knowing what to look for. And then, finally, he looked up, stunned. I don't believe it," he shook his head in disbelief. "She's right. He's not fully paralyzed. There's still nerve function." John's chest tightened. "What does that mean?" Dr. Mitchell exhaled deeply. "It means there's a chance." Emma's face lit up. John ran a hand over his face. "What do we have to do?" The vet hesitated. "It won't be easy. He'll need therapy, support, constant care. He may never be the same again." John looked at his daughter. She was already nodding. "We'll do it," she said firmly. "We'll help him." John grinned despite himself. "Well," he said, shaking his head, "looks like we're not giving up just yet." Dr. Mitchell gave a small smile. "Then, let's get to work." And just like that, everything changed. The battle to save Shadow had begun. Emma refused to leave his side, her small hands constantly brushing against his coat, whispering words of encouragement. She didn't understand all the science, the medical talk, or the treatments Dr. Mitchell explained, but she believed in Shadow, and somehow that was enough. John had never seen his daughter more determined. Every morning before the sun rose, she was in the stable. Every night, long after the ranch hands had gone home, she was still there, sitting with Shadow, reading to him, promising him that he would walk again. But Shadow was weak. Days passed, then weeks, and nothing seemed to change. Dr. Mitchell had designed a rehabilitation plan, but it was slow. Shadow's muscles were atrophying, his body was failing, and John, though he hated to admit it, was losing hope. One evening, as the sun set over the ranch, he stood outside the stable, watching his daughter stroke Shadow's mane. Her blonde curls fell over her face as she whispered to the stallion. John sighed. Maybe this wasn't fair. Maybe he should have let Shadow go that day. Maybe... "Daddy, look!" John's heart nearly stopped at the sound of his daughter's shriek. He ran into the stable, expecting the worst, but instead, he saw something he never thought he'd see again. Shadow was trying to stand. His front legs were planted firmly in the hay, muscles trembling, nostrils flaring with effort. His back legs, though weak, twitched and strained. For the first time in months, he was fighting back. John's breath caught in his throat. "Oh my God," Emma was beaming. "See, Daddy? He's not giving up." Shadow let out a deep, labored breath and collapsed back into the hay, exhausted. But for the first time, John saw something in the stallion's eyes. Determination. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance. From that day forward, everything changed. Shadow's therapy became more intense. Dr. Mitchell designed a harness system that allowed him to be lifted into a standing position without putting full weight on his hind legs. It was brutal. Shadow struggled. There were days when it felt hopeless. Days when he would collapse in exhaustion, sweat dripping from his body, his breaths coming in short, painful gasps. John wanted to quit, but every time he looked at Emma, he couldn't. She believed in Shadow more than anyone. So he kept going. The ranch hands started helping. They massaged Shadow's legs, stretched his muscles, did everything they could to keep his body from breaking down. Then, one morning, it happened. It was early, barely dawn. The stable was cool, the scent of fresh hay thick in the air. Emma was sitting in her usual spot, humming softly as she ran her fingers through Shadow's mane. And then, Shadow moved. Not just his front legs, his back legs. Emma's eyes widened. "Daddy!" she shrieked. "Come quick!" John bolted into the stable, expecting another failed attempt, but when he saw what was happening, he couldn't believe his eyes. Shadow was standing, on his own. It wasn't perfect, his legs were trembling and he swayed slightly, but he was up. He was fighting. John felt something wet slip down his cheek. He didn't even realize he was crying. Emma was jumping up and down. "I told you, Daddy, I told you!" And for the first time in months, John finally believed it too. Shadow wasn't just surviving, he was winning. The ranch was alive with hope. Shadow's recovery became the heart of Willow Creek Ranch. Word spread quickly. Neighbors, ranch hands, even local news stations started visiting to witness the unbelievable. A horse once declared paralyzed was standing again. But Emma wasn't satisfied with standing. She wanted more. "He's going to run again," she told her father one morning as they stood in the stable, watching Shadow take shaky steps inside his stall. John hesitated, his arms crossed tightly. "Sweetheart, we don't know that for sure. Walking is one thing, but running, that's—" "He will," she said firmly, turning to look at Shadow. "I know he will." John sighed. He had learned by now that when Emma set her mind to something, there was no stopping her. And, deep down, a part of him was starting to believe it too. By the time spring rolled around, Shadow was walking without assistance. His steps were careful but strong. His muscles were slowly rebuilding. His spirit had never been brighter, but he hadn't run, not yet. John watched every day, waiting for a sign that Shadow was ready. But something held the stallion back. Fear? Doubt? Pain? No one knew. Then, one crisp morning, everything changed. Emma was leading Shadow through the pasture, the golden sunrise casting long shadows across the rolling fields. She had started riding him bareback for short distances, nothing too demanding, just enough to remind him who he used to be. That morning, though, something felt different. John stood at the fence, watching closely, his hands gripping the wooden beam so tightly his knuckles turned white. Emma leaned forward, pressing her hands gently against Shadow's neck. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. "I'm right here." Shadow snorted, his ears flicked forward, his muscles tensed beneath Emma's small frame. Then, it happened. With a sudden, powerful kick of his hind legs, Shadow took off. Not just a step, not just a trot, a full, thundering gallop. John's breath caught in his throat as he watched the impossible. The stallion who was once left for dead, who was supposed to be put down, was running. Not limping, not stumbling, running. And Emma, his tiny, fearless daughter, was clinging to him, laughing as the wind whipped through her hair. Tears blurred John's vision. He had never seen something so beautiful. Shadow ran like he had never stopped, like he had been waiting for this moment his whole life. And maybe he had. John climbed over the fence, his boots sinking into the soft earth as he sprinted toward them, his heart hammering. When Shadow finally slowed, Emma slid off, running straight into her father's arms. "I told you, Daddy," she gasped, her face flushed, her eyes shining with joy. "I told you he'd run again." John hugged her tight, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, baby," he whispered. "You did." Shadow stood beside them, his coat gleaming in the morning sun, his chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. He wasn't just back, he was stronger than ever. And it was all because of a little girl who never gave up. Shadow's story became legend. People came from all over to see him, the horse that defied the odds. Veterinarians studied his recovery, calling it a miracle of resilience. Scientists were baffled. No one could explain how he healed, how he regained function, how he thrived. But John and Emma knew the truth. It wasn't just medicine, it wasn't just therapy, it was love. It was a 6-year-old girl who believed in the impossible, and a horse who refused to let go. As the years passed, Shadow remained Emma's best friend. They rode together, ran together, grew together, and every time they raced across the open fields, kicking up golden dust beneath the morning sun, John Carter stood on the porch of Willow Creek Ranch, watching in silent awe, because he had almost made the worst mistake of his life. He had almost given up. But Emma never did. And because of that, Shadow ran free.